Policy and economy discussions in India focus a great deal on the jobs crisis. Creating sustainable livelihoods is, of course, important, but insufficient attention is paid to the question of minimum wages. We don't realize how important minimum wages are and how much of a bottleneck the Indian minimum wage system is. The labour codes introduced by the Modi government have made a modest start on addressing this question. In today's episode, I ask Radhicka Kapoor of ICRIER to explain why India cannot hope to become rich without repairing its minimum wage system. Hi, Radhika. It's great to have you again on the podcast.
Hi Pooja, great to be back.
Today, I want to talk to you about something that, as you've been educating me, probably should be talked about a lot more in India, but is unfortunately not. Policy and economy conversations focus a great deal on jobs creation, as they should, but not as much on wage rates and pays. And so people don't really realize how a fair and effective minimum wage policy can also be a way of driving up aggregate demand, increasing the size of the middle class, and basically catalyzing sustainable and inclusive growth. So let me start today by requesting you to explain first this link between minimum wage policy and demand and growth stimulus, which is something that is being talked a lot about in the context of the COVID crisis. And then I will, ask you later to explain the various complexities and the weaknesses in the Indian minimum wage system. But first, let's, please explain to us what is this link between minimum wage policy and demand and growth stimulus?
So thank you for that question, Pooja. The conversation that we had last time, we essentially focused on the jobs challenge. But India faces as much a wage problem as it does a jobs problem. Because we know that on average, wages are quite low in the Indian context. There is a demand crisis in the Indian economy. There's a structural demand problem, which has in fact been brewing even before COVID struck. And this has accentuated in a post-COVID world. Now, how do we tackle this wages problem? Now, one way of tackling this issue is through a minimum wage policy. What a minimum wage would effectively do is basically set a wage floor at the absolute bottom of the labor market. Now, if this minimum wage is set at an appropriate level, and we'll go into that discussion in a little while, I presume, that can play a very important role in catalyzing demand. Demand from the bottom of the distribution, demand from those people who in fact have a high marginal propensity to consume. So therefore, thinking of a minimum wage policy, which is designed in a way to stimulate demand, can be particularly useful in the Indian context today. Now, typically, when we talk of minimum wages, you look at the discussion in the ILO or the way it's happened in India. We see it in the context of preventing exploitation of workers from the perspective of poverty alleviation, addressing inequality, and all of that is very relevant. But in today's time, from a macroeconomic context, it becomes very relevant to look at this from the perspective of fueling demand from the bottom of the income distribution.
Right, because as we know, people who are rich, that side of the demand will probably recover as the uncertainty around COVID decreases. But the real challenge is to make sure that people who are at the bottom of the pyramid are able to come out and have some purchasing power. And for that, wage rates are definitely important, as important as having jobs, is because more than 90% of the labor, as we discussed last time, is in informal jobs, in some form of job or the other. It's just that they don't get paid well. Now, people such as you, experts on minimum wages, have been having this conversation on minimum wages for nearly 100 years now in India. This discussion goes back to the 1920s, as you were telling me, and by 1948, we already had a Minimum Wages Act. And yet, as the economic survey noted a few years back, even today, 1 in every 3 wage workers in India is not protected by the minimum wage law. So we have a law, but the law is not effective, which is pretty much the story in so many areas in India. The present minimum wage system seems to be extremely complex, with as many as, if I'm not wrong, 1,900 minimum wages defined for various scheduled job categories for skilled, unskilled workers across various states. Is that why the minimum wages legislation and protection does not work because it's so complex?
Absolutely, Pooja. India has been talking about minimum wages way before most other developing countries. We actually had a Royal Commission for Labor in 1926, and that is where this idea of minimum wages preventing exploitation of workers started. And by 1948, we had a Minimum Wage Act. But what this act did was actually quite interesting. Instead of ensuring that there was universal coverage, of minimum wages across all workers, what ended up happening under this act was that there were certain scheduled employments that were listed. And it was only people who were working under these scheduled employments that got covered under minimum wages. So what also ended up happening in this structure is that when you had different schedules of employment, even within a given schedule, people were paid different minimum wages according to what skill level they had, or depending on what geographical location they were in. So just to give you an example, the minimum wage structure in India is so complex at this particular point. If you look, for example, at the state of Andhra Pradesh. Now, if I am an unskilled worker working in the electronics industry, my minimum wage is different from that. It would be if I were a highly skilled worker, which would be different from if I were a semi-skilled worker. Another example is even if you look at, say, unskilled workers. If I'm an unskilled worker working in the construction industry, as opposed to an unskilled worker working in a bakery, as opposed to an unskilled worker, working in a tea shop, my minimum wage would be different, even within the same state. So what we've ended up doing with our minimum wage architecture is that we don't create a single minimum wage. Now, of course, creating a single minimum wage at the national level is very difficult in a country as diverse as India and where costs of living are so different across states. But even at the state level, we've actually ended up creating such a complex wage structure. We literally try to set the wage in different occupations by skill, by zones. So we have this complex minimum wage structure. And that structure is so complex that we can't, in fact, enforce it effectively. So not only is it not universal because it doesn't cover all workers, but it's also so complex that the workers who are covered under it don't get that protection. Now, actually, this is changing a bit because we have the new Code on Wages. The Minimum Wage Act has been subsumed under the Code on Wages. And the one good thing that has come out now is that minimum wages will in fact be universal. So they will be applied across the board, both to the organized and the unorganized sector. So that's been one improvement. But of course, the complexity of the architecture still remains because even under the new Code on Wages, it seems that wages will be determined by things like your skill, by the arduousness of the work that you're doing, geographical location, or any other factor actually that the government deems appropriate. So while the complexity doesn't appear to be changing, at least we have universal coverage.
So what should minimum wages really depend on? I can understand that if somebody is in a hazardous job and they need to be given some difficulty premium, but shouldn't minimum wage be dependent on covering some basic human needs necessary for dignified human existence? Should the levels of skills and ability enter into the minimum wage legislated, or should those parts of a wage be left to the left to the market forces, and the legislated minimum wage should only come out of what we think is some basic human needs necessary for dignified human existence, that should be specified.
So before trying to identify what is the level at which we should set the minimum wage, I think first we should be clear on what is the objective of our wage policy. Now, if, as you know, the Minimum Wage Act suggests, the objective of the act is in fact poverty alleviation, it is to ensure that certain basic, minimum human needs are met, then that is basically all the criteria that you need. Now, if I have to be able to purchase a certain basket of goods and services, which is essential for bare sustenance, then it shouldn't matter, if I'm a skilled worker or I'm an unskilled worker, if I'm working in a bakery or I'm working in the electronics industry. Now, it would matter depending on which state I live and whether, where I live is an expensive place to stay or not. So other than geographical location, to my mind, there should be no reason for creating this complex architecture minimum wages, where wages are defined as per what employment you're doing or what is your skill level. And in that sense, I think if we think of how we should actually simplify the minimum wage structure, one possible way of doing this is that if you basically want to ensure poverty alleviation and you want to protect those who are at the absolute bottom of the labor market, which is basically casual workers, then you should simply set a minimum wage for these casual workers. And if that minimum wage is set at an appropriate level and it is effectively enforced and implemented, then that actually helps to enhance the bargaining power of many other low-paid workers and workers in the informal sector. And then the wages for the rest can be determined by market forces. We don't need this complex system of creating a minimum wage structure. We just have to set the lowest common denominator and let the market forces operate for the rest.
That sounds very logical to me. And in fact, that minimum level could probably be the NREGA wage rate, because that is your safety net. That is what you go and do when you have no other work. So should that not be the minimum wage level? Is it the minimum wage level as of now?
So in principle, I agree with you that, an effective way of enforcing a minimum wage actually is that I set the wage for the lowest common denominator, which is casual labor in the agricultural sector. And that minimum wage, that can be set at the NREGA wage. And then essentially the enforcement problem gets tackled to a great deal itself. But what's really interesting in the Indian context is that actually NREGA wages in most states, in fact, in 17 out of 21 large states, are in fact lower than minimum wages which are paid in agriculture. And there's a little bit of history to this, that when NREGA was introduced, the NREGA Act has two provisions. There's Section 6.1, which basically says that the central government can notify NREGA wages at the state level, and Section 6.2, which says that until the time that the central government actually notifies the state NREGA wages, NREGA workers have to be paid minimum wages for agricultural wages in that state. Now, to begin with, when NREGA was introduced, then the second option was chosen, which is that the NREGA wages were in line with the state level agricultural wages, minimum agricultural wages. But what ended up happening is that a number of states started actually increasing the minimum wages for the agricultural workers. And because the wage bill for NREGA was borne by the central government, it became very expensive for the central government to fund the program. So they then decided in 2009 that basically they would notify NREGA wages, and those would be outside the ambit of state minimum wages. And this wage rate was set at 100 rupees a day in 2009. And of course, it's been adjusted for inflation periodically, but despite that, real wages have actually not increased very much up until recently. So yes, I mean, the first problem is that NREGA wages are actually are less than state minimum wages for agriculture.
And conceptually, you're saying it would make sense for the minimum wage to be set at the level of the NREGA wage, which means it would require a revision upwards. Well, if it was to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, conceptually, it would make implementing minimum wage much easier, especially now that you're extending it to the unorganized sector. And of course, there is also an argument that if the objective of NREGA is to provide livelihood security, then why should workers working in the program not receive minimum wages? Also, if the central government is the employer of last resort, as is under NREGA, why should the central government not be paying minimum wages? How do you expect your private sector to pay minimum wages when the central government itself is not paying minimum wages? And in fact, there have been a lot of disputes about this. There have been several committees that have been set up to look into whether NREGA should pay state minimum wages. There was a case in the Andhra Pradesh High Court, I think, in 2009 or 10, when Narega workers went to the High Court and they said that why is the centre not paying minimum wages under Narega? And the argument from the centre has consistently been that basically because the Minimum Wages Act covers only certain scheduled employments and the nature of work that is done under Narega is not the same as the nature of work under those scheduled employments, there is no reason to be paying minimum wages. So there has been back and forth on these issues. And interestingly, in the Code on Wages, which was passed in 2019 and will come into effect on 1st April this year, even though minimum wages have been made universal, the government now, in fact, has a national floor level minimum wage rate, but the code clearly says that this code is not going to cover any provisions under NREAGA. So therefore, even any legal provision for appealing for providing minimum wages under Narega now gets closed.
It sounds really, I mean, it defies logic, I think. But this floor level that is being set, what level is it at? Is it too low, high, or is it appropriate? Are you satisfied with this floor level that is being set?
The question of what that level is also interesting and has a bit of a history. When the Minimum Wage Act was introduced in 1948, it didn't actually lay out what the criteria should be for defining that minimum wage. In 1957, there was an Indian Labour Conference, and they in fact laid out these 5 criteria for what are the elements that should be covered under the minimum wage. It was a calorie intake of 2,700 calories per person per day. There were some clothing requirements, minimum housing requirements, and some minimum expenditure for light fuel, etc. And it's basically this 1957 criteria of the Indian Labour Conference, which is what we are still using actually to compute our minimum wages. In 1992, the Supreme Court noted that this criteria was, absolutely insufficient, and it needed to be expanded to include things like children's education, medicinal requirements, pensions, etc. So combined with the Supreme Court judgment in 92 and the Indian Labour Conference 1957 guidelines, minimum wages have been determined in India up until now. And so therefore we are really operating with a very dated sort of criteria to compute what minimum wages are in India. And the government, in fact, appointed an expert committee to look at what that minimum wage level should be. And this committee clearly said that the earlier criteria was inadequate in today's times, given the changing consumption patterns, given demographic changes, and they came up with a revised criteria, according to which they said that national floor level wages in India should be 375 rupees per day. But what they actually were notified by the government was 178 rupees per day. So there is no denying the fact that given these dated guidelines, the minimum wages in India are really far too low. In fact, just last year, there was a report by the ILO where they did a ranking of countries in the Asia and Pacific on the basis of the level of minimum wages, and India was 3rd from the bottom. So there is considerable, scope for increasing these minimum wages. And also let me point out that even at this low level of floor, which is 178 rupees a day, there is still a large percentage of the workforce that earns even below this. I mean, even as of 2018-19, if you look at the periodic labor force survey data, about 45% of casual workers were not even earning 178 rupees per day. I mean, that gives you, is indicative of the extent of the wages problem in the labor market today.
I'm curious, Radhicka, why was the notified wage lower than what the committee had recommended?
So actually, this national floor level wage was adopted in India in 1996, and this was at that time set at 35 rupees per day, and then it was adjusted for inflation, and by 2018-19, it had increased to 176 rupees per day. It was around this time that the government appointed this expert committee, and the committee said that there was a need to relook the guidelines. But I think because the wage obviously appeared too high, given what the national floor level wage was, before this, it was almost a doubling of the floor level wage rate, which would have created, definitely a lot of political opposition, because having such a big jump would create a rippling effect in terms of enhancing workers' bargaining power. So I'm not surprised that the government chose not to go with the recommendations, or they're still on hold. We don't know what's going to happen to them. But having said that, the other side of the coin, we have to factor that in as well. That while we increase minimum wages, and there is no denying the fact that there is a need to do so in the Indian context, because the minimum wages are so abysmally low, but they will have implications for what happens to our micro, small, and medium enterprises, and what is going to happen to the small farmers who make use of casual agricultural labor. So all these things also need to be factored in.
Sure, yeah. An important consideration is obviously going to be that higher minimum wage will affect the functioning and the viability of smaller companies more than the larger ones. And here, do you think there's any scope for, because ultimately minimum wages will need to be corrected. So is there any scope for kind of cushioning this, increase that is required? Is there any role for, some sort of government intervention? Is that even advisable? I know that every time something goes wrong, we begin to look at government for solutions. Is that going to be a good idea in this case, or what's the way forward then?
Well, in our particular case at this point, as I told you, the level is just so low that there is a very strong argument for increasing the minimum wage. And internationally, if you look at the literature, especially in developing countries, what you see is that when you increase the minimum wage, that helps to increase the wages in the informal sector amongst low-paid workers. It increases their bargaining power. It's called the lighthouse effect. What this also does is that it increases demand in the economy, that some of that demand might happen at the more local level. So there are positive externalities to increasing that minimum wage, some of which might not be factored in by an individual firm. And I completely understand that. But there has to be perhaps an intervention on the part of the state where there is some sort of support to encourage creation of these good, well-paying jobs. Because these good, well-paying jobs have positive externalities, and the state has to come in and support them in some way. It could be through tax credits or through any other creative mechanism. But having said that, I'm saying that minimum wages at this point are not so high that a small increase in these will lead to any big dent for the enterprises.
Also because at least in the organized jobs, we've seen that the government has been subsidizing since last year the retirement savings part of it. So maybe they could think of something like that, that sort of intervention for the informal jobs, like
Well,
you
yeah,
said, tax credits.
we've been having a lot of these in the formal sector. You also have a scheme where the government, pays a part of the EPFO contribution on behalf of the employer and the employee to encourage creation of formal jobs. We need to be more creative in thinking about such schemes for the informal sector, because obviously these firms are out of any sort of tax net, and it's difficult to reach out to these firms in terms of providing them support. But I think it's also important to recognize that many of these people who are in the informal sector, who are doing this self-employment, who are engaged in own account enterprises, a lot of these people are doing this work simply because there are not enough better, well-paying jobs out there. So if you can create more of these better, well-paying jobs, say in the formal sector, a lot of these people will transition from the informal to the formal sector.
Right. So it works both ways. If you have a good minimum wage policy and you create good jobs, then the informal sector, you're likely to see people migrating from the informal sector to formal sector, which is good for overall growth and demand stimulus, right?
Potentially, because when that increase in the minimum wage happens, it also expands your demand. That creates more demand for labor, possibly in the formal sector also. So there are lots of spillover effects. I mean, apart from poverty alleviation, apart from pulling up wages and reducing inequality within wage distribution, there are these other added benefits as well.
So probably it's a leap of faith that should be taken. Other than that, do you think there are any other steps that need to be taken to develop or deepen various labor market institutions where minimum wages and collective bargaining is concerned?
From the perspective of minimum wages and collective bargaining, there's a large unorganized sector, and it's difficult for them to come together to demand higher wages. In fact, let me say that even in the organized sector today, the workforce doesn't have significant bargaining power because you have this proliferation of non-standard work arrangements, which have diminished their bargaining power. In this context, if you really want to give workers a credible outside option, I think having these employment guarantee programs which pay minimum wages is really the most effective way going forward. So this is really going back to what we discussed about Narega. But I do want to add here that for any of this mechanism to actually work through, that if you were to use the Narega wages and set them at set minimum wages at the Narega level, you would really need to improve implementation of Narega. We know there are a lot of leakages there are a lot of loopholes there are delays in payments, and unfortunately, Narega actually performs better in the more well-off states. And the poorer states where you need to do more poverty alleviation, it's performing relatively worse there. So you would need to significantly enhance implementation of Narega. What you would also need to do is that make work available all year round, because for this to serve as a credible outside option and in fact enhance the bargaining power of your labor, Narega work should be made available all year round. So all of this will of course entail a huge increase in the budget of Narega, enhancing state capacity to implement the program. But it seems like a relatively easier way of correcting the minimum wage architecture in India. I think it's something that we should certainly look into now, especially that we have this minimum wage code, which is universal. So we have to think about how any of these minimum wages are going to apply to the unorganized sector. Even though you have all these inspectors who are not, well, now they're not called inspectors, they're called facilitators in the code, but they're going to go and check if there are any violation of minimum wages and so on and so forth. Implementation is really challenging in a country like India. So the best is to actually create these kind of safety nets that serve as a credible safety net.
So we keep running into the same old problem of capacity constraints and improvements again become hostage to the same capacity constraints. But thank you so much, Radhika. Thank you for talking to me on this very important topic.
Thank you.